The alarm has been going off for 3 minutes now. The darkness in the room still presses on your eyelids. You are not really asleep anymore, but you are not getting up either. Right there, exactly there, the negotiation begins. 5 more minutes, you tell yourself, your voice still thick with sleep. An excuse that sounds almost reasonable. A tiredness that feels almost convincing, assembled in half a second flat. A voice that never says, "I am weak." It says, "I genuinely need this today," more than usual. And that is exactly why it wins so often, morning after morning after morning. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a man left behind a note that looks strangely like this exact same fight. We know this from private notes that survived under the name Meditations. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, had to remind himself every single morning why he had to get up in a freezing tent near the Danube. Marcus had just buried several of his own children. A plague was tearing through his empire, city after city, with no legion able to do a single thing about it. A man carrying that kind of grief has every right to stay in bed forever. Nobody would have judged him for it. And yet the first empire he had to govern every day was not Rome, not its borders, not its distant provinces. It was the 5 minutes between waking up and the first foot placed on the ground. A territory so small that commanding entire legions could not have conquered it for him. Bed was never the problem. The problem was knowing who actually commanded the next 5 minutes. You do not lose the morning, you lose yourself, 5 minutes at a time. That is the first Stoic principle almost nobody applies in their own life, no matter how many quotes about it they have read. Marcus did not discover this discipline the day he became emperor. He was trained for it as a child, adopted young by the Emperor Antoninus Pius as his future heir, handed to demanding tutors, among them a man named Junius Rusticus, who had him reading early Stoic texts before most boys his age were reading anything at all. We do not know exactly how many nights he actually spent on a bare wooden board with no mattress under him. But the ancient accounts suggest he was exposed early to a harsh discipline, an almost instinctive distrust of comfort, so he would learn that comfort was never an entitlement, only a habit you could choose to keep or let go of. The silence of those cold childhood rooms was worth every lesson in the world combined. Power over an empire came later. Power over himself was taught to him much earlier, patiently, year after year, long before anyone called him emperor. Decades later, on that same frozen frontier, that same childhood training had never once left him. He was not improvising anything that night in his tent. He was repeating a reflex learned so long ago, it no longer even looked like effort from the outside. And yet, even after all those years, this exact fight never once became easy. Maybe that is what real discipline actually is. Less a burst of willpower than a habit so old it feels like instinct, carved into the hands before it ever reaches the thoughts. But still, every single morning, a fight that has to be fought all over again. That war against the Germanic tribes never lasted just a few weeks. The fighting stretched on for more than a decade, almost until his final breath. Thousands of nearly identical mornings made up that decade, far more than one heroic decision on one particular morning. The same hostile frontier, the same freezing wind against the tent fabric, the same trap laid out fresh every single day, the same temptation to stay lying down just a little longer. Maybe that is the detail people forget most easily. The discipline was never one spectacular choice. It was the same small choice, repeated over and over, in the dark of a tent with nobody there to applaud it. You would expect an emperor facing a war that expensive to simply raise taxes and move on. He didn't. In the Forum of Trajan, in broad daylight, the crowd watches. One servant lifts the emperor's own drinking cup onto the auction table. Another carries out silk robes, still warm from his skin. Someone in the crowd recognizes the empress's own jewelry. No one speaks. Marcus Aurelius stood there and let it happen, stripping himself of everything in public before he would ever add to the weight already sitting on his people's shoulders. The same principle that got him out of bed every freezing morning. Duty comes before comfort, whether that comfort is a warm bed or a palace full of gold. We know the size of this discipline not because he ever boasted about it, but only through private notes that were probably never meant to be read by anyone else. And that notebook never looked like a book. Short notes, sometimes a single sentence, written night after night, with no chapters built, no plan announced in advance, no visible order at all. Maybe that is exactly why those pages still sound so true, even now. A man does not write to lie to himself, especially not at 3 a.m, exhausted on a frontier at war. He writes down what is actually hard for him, not what would sound impressive to some imagined future reader. Looking for motivation that particular morning would have been a waste of time. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings freeze fast under a tent at 0 degrees, exactly as fast as they had flared up the night before. He was reaching for something else, a fact, plain and cold, that no amount of tiredness could argue with or negotiate away. Marcus reminded himself that ants, bees, and birds do their work at dawn without ever arguing with themselves about it first. He too, he told himself, was born to do the work of a human being, the same way those creatures do theirs, instead of staying warm under a blanket like an animal that only knows its own comfort. Right there, every single morning, that tiny territory everything else depended on was won or lost all over again. What if the real problem was never tiredness at all, but a disguise for a fight actually happening somewhere else entirely? How many mornings have you actually been postponing something different? That hard phone call, that overdue conversation, that decision you keep delaying with the exact same excuse. Every negotiation with the alarm is, underneath, a negotiation with the man you meant to be that day, something you already knew, somewhere, even before your eyes opened. You know that voice too. It never says, "I am lazy." That would be too honest to be convincing. It says, "I will be more efficient after 10 more minutes." Marcus Aurelius never dismissed that voice as laziness. To him, it was something far more dangerous, a betrayal so small you almost never notice it happening, repeated in the silence of a tent where nobody could judge him for it. Negotiating with that voice already means admitting it might be right. It does not need to win the whole day. It only needs those first 5 minutes. And whoever controls your first 5 minutes controls the rest of your day, whether you notice the handoff or not. The ancient philosophers already had a word for this exact moment. Akrasia, acting against what you already know with total clarity, is the right thing to do. Not ignorance, not stupidity, just that brief instant where knowing is no longer enough to move you. Marcus's own teachers had studied this mechanism long before he ever needed it. The way you study an opponent before you can disarm it. Stop. Tomorrow morning, don't change anything. Just notice the first sentence your mind says the second that alarm goes off. That sentence is the whole fight right there. Nothing has really changed since then. You do not have a tent or a frozen frontier. You have a phone on the nightstand, a screen that lights up in the dark, and a button built for that exact same negotiation. It even has a name. Snooze. 9 more minutes, not one less, as if someone had calculated it on purpose to sound reasonable.
And yet you wake up again?
Just as tired, sometimes with your head even heavier than before you touched that button. All it really buys you is a few borrowed minutes, handed to a slightly weaker version of you who has to make the same choice all over again. You reach for the phone, only to check the time. But the screen lights up. A notification appears, then another. Somewhere in those 3 seconds, control changes hands, quietly, without a fight. That morning, whoever sent that notification was holding it, not you. His answer, Marcus Aurelius's answer, fit into one motion. Not a long internal speech about the perfect day ahead or the energy he needed to feel before acting. 1 foot on the ground, immediately. That first foot has nothing heroic about it. It is cold. It is clumsy. It hates being there.
But it is honest.
And that is enough, because once that foot is down, the negotiation changes shape entirely. You are no longer trying to convince yourself from inside the bed. You have already started leaving it. The body understanding one concrete action faster than it ever understands an abstract argument. 5 more minutes of sleep look almost insignificant, taken on their own. But that tiny decision becomes almost every time the silent template for the 100 decisions that follow that same day. A man who loses this fight every morning does not just lose a few minutes of sleep. He loses one small proof at a time, the certainty that he still holds the reins of his own life. All of this looks tiny, almost ridiculous, next to the real trials of a life. A war, a plague, the death of a child. You will probably never govern an empire or bury a child to an epidemic. But every morning you face your own miniature version of the exact same question. Do you command it, or does the voice? Marcus Aurelius seemed to understand that it is precisely there, in what nobody else notices or cares about, that a man's respect for himself gets quietly built or quietly torn down. That respect never shows up all at once. It accumulates, morning after morning, like a debt you either pay down or let grow in silence. Winning this fight earns you nothing anyone else will ever see. No applause, no witness at all. Just a quiet certainty, kept or lost, one morning at a time, in a room where nobody is watching but you. Writing these lines in his tent, he still had no idea he would die far from Rome, on that same frontier, most likely from the very same plague he had watched tear through his empire, city after city. He never chose any of those mornings knowing he was running out of time. Marcus chose it the same way he chose all the others, never once knowing which morning would turn out to be his last. From the very beginning, it was never the bed. It was command of the next 5 minutes. You do not lose the morning. You lose yourself, 5 minutes at a time. Tomorrow morning, that voice will come back. It always does. The question isn't whether it speaks. The question is whether you answer. Put 1 foot on the floor before you decide anything else. Now tell me honestly, just once, without lying to yourself. What does that voice say to you every morning before you decide whether to listen to it?